What you're looking at now is the default configuration that fvwm uses when it's first started, assuming that you don't have a configuration file of your own defined. And out of the box, it's not necessarily clear how you're supposed to interact with this, other than you see perhaps a window on the screen and something to the right hand side that you may or may not find immediately obvious as to what it's supposed to be conveying and doing. And one of the problems that we come across is people that look at this window manager and others coming from a very specific or often set of assumptions that they've had using other environments, and that often doesn't translate or map across to these different environments, and so it often feels as though the barrier to entry is much higher. But fvwm is modelled on what are considered now, anyway, old usage patterns and interaction patterns. It comes from an era when the way in which windows were displayed, how you would interact with them, was actually quite consistent across lots of different computing platforms. Now we are quite fortunate in that we have a myriad of different window managers, but also we have larger players such as desktop environments, and they provide a greater homogeneous experience for most users, and they often drive and set certain behavioural aspects in terms of how we are supposed to interact and use applications in those environments. And although KDE and GNOME are different, the major thing that they both share in common is the fact that their style is consistent, because they both typically have their core set of applications written against their own widget library. In the case of KDE, that's the Qt widget library. In the case of GNOME, that's GTK. And that's fine, because that makes things nice and easy. You have settings dialogues that within the desktop environment you can expose to the user, and they can tweak and change things. But the interaction and the behavior driven aspect of those things remains completely static. With window managers, though, that embellishment, that homogeneity between how you interact goes away, because with window managers the expectation is that the user has a much clearer idea around the workflow that they want to use. And although it can often appear unfriendly if you're coming from that starting point in terms of what you can do, if you understand how you can build up that functionality and how that's described, then that can actually be a very powerful tool to put these building blocks of interactions in place. And so what I thought I'd do is just take a look at the default configuration that you're seeing here, and just talk through some of the sort of key points around our thinking when we came up with it. So I have an Xterm here, and the configuration file itself has been loaded into Vim. And actually, the first thing to note is this Xterm, the color of the borders, the color of the title bar, the buttons, they are all specified in this configuration file. And this is the entry point to defining and changing the behavior as you see it here. And the way to do that is to click on the root window, which is this black background here. And in doing that with the left hand mouse button, you do get a window that allows you to select certain things. Some people, and I do have that on fairly good authority, some people have been known to stick with the default configuration file as is and make absolutely no changes whatsoever, which is fair enough, that's their choice. I myself, being a little bit more precise in what I want and look for, would definitely want to change this. And the way that we do that out of the box is to click on the root window here and select this copy config option, and when I do that, I get a dialog pop up that tells me that various actions will be performed if I click this confirm button. I'm not going to do that because that would that would actually move my current configuration out of the way. I don't want that because I've got my own set of configs that I use. But this is a nice fail-safe if you do happen to have a configuration. But if you were to do that, all that would happen is the configuration would be copied into your home area and this .fvwm directory. You would then be able to edit the file called config, because that's the file that fvwm looks for when it starts up. So because this file is the entry point for specifying and changing behavior, we have really tried to add as much documentation as we possibly can to make it a bit easier. There are no hard and fast rules, though, about the ordering. It's just a suggestion. In reality, fvwm will actually read the configuration file top to bottom. There are some circumstances through which it won't always execute the line that it reads in, and I'll speak about that later on. But most lines, when they're read in, if they're able to be run, will be run. So just bear the ordering in mind, because, as I say, it is top down. And because this is a descriptive set of commands, in fact it's more than that. I would actually describe this as a lightweight domain specific language, or DSL, because there is some power behind this. It does take a little bit of getting used to, so don't be necessarily put off by that. Once you can wrap your head around some of the concepts, describing your intent in terms of what you're trying to do becomes a little easier, and I think having this ordering definitely helps. So we have, as the first block, a set of variables that we define. These are actually internal to fvwm itself. You can, if you want to, actually set environment variables that will then be inherited by applications started by fvwm. However, that can start to pollute the environment quite a bit sometimes and describe what I would say leak into the environment, and that's not always necessarily what people want. So for things that define the terminals to run or commands to run from menus, it makes better sense to store these internally to fvwm. You can do that via this info store add command. So we have three variables here that we set. One is a terminal called which defines xterm. Most people are likely to want to change this. Xterm is the reference standard actually for terminal emulators, and so it has over the years gained a reputation for being the de facto terminal that is often installed by most distributions, and certainly under the BSDs that's the case as well. So when we're talking about a configuration file that is designed to try and run on most systems that we can think of, we do have to try and pick defaults that are likely to cover as many bases as we can, and that can sometimes translate into choices that are perhaps not to one's aesthetic, and so most people are likely to want to change this to their own terminal emulator because they likely have their own favourite. This run command just does something similar. Here we're using dmenu. That's a popular external tool to actually run commands from by just typing directly the command that you want, and it can do things like completions and such like. Not everything that's provided by fvwm can be used to the effect of all users. So there are some parts of functionality that will just require external tools, and again, it's just worth reminding that this is a window manager. It manages the window. It doesn't provide the full-blown environment to provide the things that desktop environments do. So now we put the default for desktop configuration set to global. I have in video 2, I believe, already spoken about this at some length, but the comments should describe that. But if you do want to see that in more detail, do have a look at that video. And then we come to talk about functions, and functions are a way of aggregating specific commands of fvwm together into a unit, and there are various conditions through which these different actions that you want to ask of fvwm can be applied, and you can see those listed here. So you are able to define a function that perhaps does one thing immediately, raise, and then depending on whether you try and move the window or double click the window, then it will do something different, and that's quite powerful, and you can see an example of that here on line 86 to 88. So start function here is special. Start function is the entry point, if you like, into where most of the behavior for fvwm will take place. It's the function that people should define when they're thinking of starting applications or doing things that should only happen at startup, hence the name. But it is a little more powerful than that, because start doesn't actually detail where in that particular process that is. Is that happening at the very beginning? Is it happening in the middle? Does it happen at the end? It's not clear. So there are some further conditions that we can specify if we want to be a little more granular as to actions that need to happen. We're actually looking at an example of one on line 76. So here we're saying the first action should be to check to see if we have a .bg default file in our fvwm config directory, which is .fvwm in our home area, and if that exists, then run this command fvwm root, which will set the root window to whatever value has been placed for this file here. Now we only do that at init time, which is when fvwm starts up. If we restart the window manager, then we don't see that because it's already initialized. And because these functions execute in order in terms of how they've been specified as part of the definition, this next line on 78 is a condition that says no match. So what we're saying here is, if this command on the previous line on 76 didn't do anything, or if we didn't execute that because there was no file present, and that's what this F condition is specifying, then execute the fvwm root command, this time with this particular file at this data dir location. And that's actually something that we ship as part of the default config, is our own background image. The reason why it's not displaying here, and you just see a black background, is because I've deliberately butchered that location, and this black background is as a consequence of me running startx, and X11 by default uses a black background, so that's why we have no background at all. But through most packaged installed versions of this configuration file, I would expect at the very least this command here to run just fine without any problems. And then unconditionally, we then start a buttons panel here, and we start an event, which I'll talk about further down. We do have some other functions. It isn't clear where they're being used. We would have to search this configuration file to see where they're used. In most cases, they are probably going to be used with key or mouse bindings so that we can actually describe what we want to do with windows if we click certain parts of them, but we don't have to. We may even have functions that happen when we move between desks or pages as well. So here's an example of a function, and even the comment actually says so. Here's an example of a function that runs when we change desk. So it's got 5 commands that has this cryptic center module, fvwm button, change button, blah. And what that's doing is these buttons here change desks. And when I click them, you'll notice that the color changes. So 1 is no longer in blue, but 3 is, and that's all that's doing. It's just changing the color. If we didn't do that, and when we click these buttons, everything would be in blue, and we wouldn't necessarily know which desk we were on anymore. So that's just how we do that. It's programmatically switching the colors of the buttons here. So the style section is quite important, because this is where we start to describe the way in which we want to interact with the window manager based on certain conditions. And the first thing we see is some desktop name commands and then this desktop size command. There is a guide, a behavioural manual, if you like, even a contract, I suppose you could call it, between applications and window managers that describes how Windows should behave and how window managers should react to those behaviors. And that works both ways. You can have the window manager setting up an environment and having applications query that to see what's what and then react based on that. And vice versa, you can have applications doing things in the background that the window manager can listen for and take note of and then react to. One example might be if a window receives something that requires the user's attention, then that might mean that the window should flash a notification or change its color or do something else. And that's actually a hard-coded specified action, if you like, as part of the standard. And the standard that I'm referring to is the EWMH, or the Extended Window Manager Hints guide, and that drives a lot of the behavior. And one of the aspects that has is to do with the number of desktops that can be defined. And when I talk about desktops, I actually mean the areas that you define where windows can be grouped and live and changed to, and you can see 4 examples of them here. So we've defined 4 desktops. They're numbered 0 to 3 and they all have names. This desk here is 0, is called main, and the others are labelled desk 1 to 3. And if we wanted to, we could change these to any names that we wanted. The desktop size command is unique to fvwm, and that actually describes the number of pages. So whereas desks are as large as the root window is, which for us at the moment, because we only have one screen, is this black rectangle, with pages we take that concept a step further and actually have a subdivision of the root window so that we can further have larger areas. So for example, if I start up a window here on this page, you can see it's completely distinct and separate from the window that's over here on this page. And if you look on the right, you can see the page here is telling you that there are 2 windows open, and I can switch to that page by clicking here and clicking back. I could, if I wanted to, use the mouse and switch to it there and switch back again. It's the same concept, just a different way of interacting. So Pages allow you to subdivide the desktop even further to give you more granularity over how you might want to organize any windows that might want to be on this main desktop, as we're calling it. And the fundamental difference between Pages and Desks is all of the windows on Pages are still visible. And I said before that with Pages, the root window is therefore larger than just the one thing you are viewing. And if I just scroll a little bit further, you'll see that I am between those two pages. You can see part of the previous window on that page, and you can see all of the window on this page. I can move that across a bit more. You can see that again. So you really can see that it is just one large root window. The reason why we divide these into pages and how we switch between them, although it looks like they are completely separate, they're not. And this edge scroll command is telling us how we interact when we're dealing with a desktop that is larger than the root window we're looking at. And that 100 is in units of percentages. So with 100, we are moving in both an X and a Y direction in complete screen values. So 100 is all of the screen shifted down, which is why it looks like it's separated out. If I were to put 80 here, I would end up being 20% overlapping in either direction. With desks though, the interaction with those is such that they are meant to be clean slates. So if I switch to desktop 1, you'll note that now the 2x terms I had open are no longer visible. If I move around these pages, there is nothing. The applications are still running, you can see them here, but I can't see the windows. So when we move between desks, the windows become, in Xlib parlance, unmapped. The windows themselves are hidden, but the application is still running. That mapping and unmapping between desktops is why it's impossible to sometimes move between boundaries on desktops, because the way that we have to deal with windows is quite specific. So that's the fundamental difference. So you could have a desktop size of 1 by 1, which is no pages at all, just one, and you would have just 4 desks that you would have to switch between instead. And coming from other window managers such as Xmonad, that's the typical workflow. You have one desktop and the root window is as large as you have screens and no larger. But with fvwm you can do a bit more with it there. And that's really all this is describing, is that characteristic, along with the edge scroll and edge resistance. You'll notice that if I try and move this X term down, my mouse pointer has to move quite a way before the window moves, and that's due to this setting here around edge resistance and edge move delay and edge move resistance being how that works. When I maximize this window, you'll notice that it does not cover up the panel here. That's thanks to this very oddly named base structs command, which says the number of pixels between left and right, top and bottom, should be reserved. for various screen operations. Not all of them though. You'll note, for instance, that I can move this window quite happily on top of that area, and that is deliberate. There is nothing prohibitive in the specification for the EWMH that says I shouldn't, and so therefore we do not impose that restriction. Click time is actually quite important. Some people change this, some people leave it at the default. It depends how sensitive your mouse is. In Xlib there is no concept of a mouse double click, but we need to have one because we have functions that can be bound to double click events, and so we have some code internal to fvwm that allows us to define that by checking to see how quickly we've clicked. We're within a certain millisecond time frame, and we found that 250 seconds is generally good enough. So if I try and do that here, yeah, that feels right. But you can increase or decrease that value depending on your circumstances. And now we come to some style definitions, and we're starting to move away from defining some of the interaction-based behavioural characteristics. And now we're starting to talk about the style of windows that appear. And that can take two forms. That can be setting characteristics around the look and feel of the window, although a lot of that is actually in a separate set of commands entirely. Or it can also be about defining the behavior in terms of how these windows interact against this window management specification, and so you are able to turn on and off certain behavioral traits. But here, all we're doing is we're setting some attributes for resizing opaquely, so we don't have a rubber band effect, and we're defining the focus policy as well. So if I open up a secondary terminal, when I move my mouse between these windows, you'll note that the focus shifts immediately, and that's what this sloppy focus does. It doesn't require me to click into the window before the window receives focus, which you would typically find in Windows 10 and what have you. I think these days a lot of the desktop environments do have sloppy focus. I think that XFCE does, for instance. I dare say that KDE and GNOME do as well. It does seem to be a more popular way of focusing windows, and it's certainly one that I prefer. And the mouse focus click raises option, I mean, that's important because you can therefore just click in the window once you've focused it and it will raise. So that's kind of cool. Moving on and skipping past some of this, although just one thing actually before I do that, the border color set and highlight color set and all that kind of stuff is interesting. So as we focus and unfocus windows, you'll see that they take on different characteristics and different colors. The border width is the border around the window. The handle width actually describes the handles which are in the corners of the windows, because they give a visual cue that you're able to click and drag and resize the window and do various things with it. And you can obviously increase or decrease the thickness of that just by changing these numbers here. And likewise, we can set the border color set and the highlight border color set, so that when we move the focus away or into a window, that's how the focus changes there. And talking of color sets, here they are. They are not the most obvious or descriptive names. Their names are in fact numbers, but you can see that they have attributes for foreground and background and highlight and all that kind of stuff. But really we are just building up a set of reusable definitions that we can then apply to different aspects, to windows and other areas such as menus as well. Speaking of menus, you have two choices. You can either go all out and define menus yourself, because fvwm has that capability built into it, and you can see one such menu here. This is the root menu. If you have an external menuing tool, and there are quite a few, this is the entry point for that. I do not have that installed, but most Linux distributions will have something that this menu item will then honour. And all they're doing is they're generating syntax specific menus that fvwm can then read in, and the menu structure is displayed here as a result. But if you do not want that automated means, you can do it manually. And again, with the test command, we can look to see if a program exists and only include it if indeed it does exist. So this is something that most people probably end up changing. Likewise, we've got some menu definitions for clicking on different buttons, and this menu here is one that's specific to window operations here. And if I expand that, we can see that we can also have icons on menus, and that's specified in this old syntax here repeatedly. So now we come to how we go about adding key and mouse bindings to be able to interact with Windows. I watched a video recently by somebody on YouTube who was an Arco Linux fan, and Arco Linux have just released a version of their distribution that actually ships with fvwm3, and it was interesting to watch this chap try and use this window manager for the first time, because a lot of his concepts that he was used to just did not translate into this environment. So for example, it was not obvious that he needed to click on the root window. It was not obvious how windows were supposed to be interacted with. He did not understand desks. It was a real mess. And that's not surprising, because just looking at the raw configuration, trying to hold all of the context in your head about what's what can get very tricky. But bindings are the sort of entry point for being able to enact the configurations that you're describing. And this diagram is designed to try and aid in where you're able to define bindings for key and mouse. So to look at this diagram here, this really epitomizes the typical behavior and interaction methods that you would use or would have used, particularly with the Motif window manager. So to translate this diagram into what we're seeing in front of us, the R here is the root window, which is this black background. I have no icons on the root window, so they're not present, but if we did, then they are just little windows that we can treat specifically as being icons and therefore bind different actions to them. We then have the window itself, and W is indeed inside the window. That is another binding, and what that means is clicking anywhere that is not the title bar, or indeed the four sides of the window, or indeed the four corners. They themselves, the frames we call them, the frame corners, sorry, which are there, and the sides, they all have bindings in their own right. So you could, for example, have a binding that just happened if you clicked the side there, for instance. But with that binding comes modifiers. So if you want to, and most people do, they often like to hold down Control or Alt or the Windows key. That's what we call modifiers. And we have, in this descriptive syntax, we have A for any, so it doesn't matter which, just any modifier that is happened to be held down. or specifically C for control, S for shift, M for meta, which is typically the alt key on your keyboard, or N if you don't want any modifier. Be wary of specifying N though, because that does mean that if you were to bind the letter A, or the key A, to a binding that launched Xterm, depending on where that binding was specified, pressing the key A forevermore might just launch Xterm and you would never be able to input the letter A, or at least it would become very hard to do so. So just bear that in mind, because you can sometimes land yourself in very interesting situations like that. There are other modifiers as well in the form of numbers. So if I just run the xmodmap command, you can see here that if I wanted to reference the Windows key on my keyboard, that would be mod 5, or indeed just the number 5. So you can use the xmodmap command to look at which modifiers you have available. But the usual ones, the ones that are on pretty much every keyboard, have their own designation. And here is one such example. Ignore the keyword silent, because that's just a hangover from a previous configuration that we used to have and is not really relevant so much now. But we have the command key. In this case it's F1, saying that anywhere, so not bound from any point in terms of where the mouse is. And if we hold down the meta key or the alt key, then we want to run this command menu and show that menu. So if I do that now, there I am with the root menu that we saw earlier. It's the same one here, and no matter where I put my mouse and I press that, you'll see the menu pop up, because that's what we've asked. And that pattern is true for both key and mouse bindings. The only difference here is that you would substitute the word key for mouse, and you would have a number for your mouse button instead. Okay. And that can get quite involved as well. So there are a number of buttons here that, if I'm clicking on the frame or the sides, this will call this raise move function with this resize parameter. So I suspect that if you'll note that if I overlap this window, but my intention is to resize this, then whenever I try and do that, the window gets raised immediately. And I suspect that that's what that function is doing if I were to go and look. But it just shows the power that you have in being able to define bindings that can be very specific to a part of the window. I haven't yet seen this level of granularity in other window managers. So now we come to the window decor, and that's describing how the borders, the title bar and the buttons should look. And it might surprise you to realize that these buttons on the windows here are not pix maps. They are not images at all. They're actually vectors. These are instructions to fvwm to actually draw vector-based graphics using some xlib calls, which is really quite powerful. So no images were used or indeed harmed in the making of this window decoration. I might actually do a more detailed video of decors, because they are a little tricky to understand, but you can see active and inactive, and that's largely describing how the buttons should appear when the window's focused or not. So if it's not focused, you get those three little, I think they're, I'm not quite sure what they are, dots perhaps, but when you do focus again, you see the buttons themselves, and that's all this is doing. It's redrawing those vectors based on those conditions. So with modules, these are dedicated bits of code that provide functionality that you can do things with. The IDET module is pretty dull, but it's very, very useful in debugging and being able to look at the properties of a window, because you might need that if you're looking to describe a condition that matches a very specific window, and you can do that based on the, say, the class name of the resource. But it will also tell you that there's some properties around what desk it's on, the monitor it's on, the layer it's on, the width and the height, etc. So that's one to look out for. And then you have the definition for this buttons panel for the right panel. And this will be a video in its own right, because there's a lot to cover in how you go about setting up and generating a buttons panel of your own. But you can see that there are some instructions to give buttons titles, and 0, 1, 2 and 3 corresponds to what's here. And when I click on those buttons with specifically mouse button 1, then these actions will happen, and there's two of them actually. One is to run this go to desk, another is to change the color set, and you can see that happening here, white or blue. You then have the pager, and what happens here is when we ask fvwm to actually run this panel, it will run the fvwm pager command, which is described via this set of config. And as soon as it does that, it's waiting for the pager to appear, because once that happens, the page is going to get swallowed, or to use the xlib term, reparented into this button. So it won't appear as an entity or window in its own right. It's actually contained within the button definition that we've described here. And then if it's installed, stallone tray is run, and then we have a icon manager below that, which is providing that taskbar-like view of windows that we have open, the configuration for which is specified here. And that's it. That's the sum and total of what's in the default configuration file. And you might think, well, that's not very much at all. It was never designed to be very much. It was designed to give some aid and some clue to users that want to change behavior, where to start, what to do. And there is a lot of power, I think, in thinking about how you might want to interact with the windows that are running from applications that you might use. And I think it's important to note that I'm seeing more and more people compare tiling window managers to floating window managers, and say that they're really interesting, but they're not keyboard driven. Well, actually they are keyboard driven, and this window manager can be driven purely from the keyboard if you chose to. The difference here is that we also have very concrete bindings for the mouse, if that's your preference. But my own configuration file, for example, is all keyboard driven. I barely touch the mouse. And it's important that the default concepts that you're seeing here is trying to showcase both elements. So don't go away thinking that you have to use the mouse, because you really don't. It's just that we've tried to make life easier by making the default configuration mostly mouse driven, with some key bindings as a result. So that was all I wanted to do, was to cover the default. If anyone has any questions, do please leave some comments below and I will take a look. Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks very much for watching.